Hello and welcome to Climate Watch. I'm Fei Fei. We often think of sending emails as an eco-friendly practice. It saves paper, reduces logging, and helps protect forests. But as our inboxes fill up, those emails are generating carbon emissions of their own, undermining the very purpose of going paperless. And now think about this. Most of our work today is digital, running almost entirely on electronic platforms. And what does that actually mean in terms of carbon emissions? In a previous episode, I visited a data center in Guizhou province and saw firsthand how storing and processing our digital lives affects the energy system. If you haven't heard that one yet, do check it out. I'll leave a link in the description down below. And in that story, we explored how experts are working to reform the energy system so data centers can reduce their environmental footprint. But here is the question. What about the rest of us? What can we do if we are not working directly in the energy sector? To find out, I spoke with Ian Chu. He's the founder and CEO of GreenyWeb, a Singapore-based startup that's tackling this digital mess head-on. Ian can bring us a rare perspective actually to Climate Watch because we typically hear from, scholars and NGO experts. So it's very refreshing to learn firsthand how entrepreneurs are approaching the challenges of decarbonization. Great to feature you on the podcast, Ian.
Thank you, Fei Fei, for having me, and shout out to CGTN for such a wonderful podcast program. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
First, let's start with the basics because the term like digital decarbonization is still quite new for many. And so could you first explain to us, what it's about and why does it matter now?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question, Fei Fei. So going back to the basics, a lot of what we know about technology in relation to the environment has been positive, right? So there's a lot of talk about how things like artificial intelligence, the internet, tech itself can bring good to the environment. And I don't dispute that. But the flip side is also true, whereby the amount of energy we consume for data centers, the amount of water we put into data centers, all of this has also a negative environmental impact. And that's where the terminology digital carbon emissions come in, where it's the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere indirectly because of our use of digital products and services. For example, each time we send an email, anywhere between 3 to 5 grams of carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere because of the energy used by data centers that is powered by non-renewable sources of power. So this brings us to the terminologies, right? Things like digital decarbonization and sustainable digital transformation. So these are two terms that I may use interchangeably during the course of our conversation, and they're actually two different sides of the same coin. So when we think of digital decarbonization, we're thinking along the lines of how can we reduce the data that is being consumed by existing technology to reduce the amount of energy being consumed by our CPUs and GPUs, and by extension, reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emitted through the burning of oil and gas to power our digital devices. So digital decarbonization looks at how we can decarbonize what we already have. How can we decarbonize our existing websites? How can we change the blockchain, for example, to a more eco-friendly version of what it is right now? On the other hand, sustainable digital transformation is how can we build greener for the future? How can we, for example, build a low carbon mobile application or green AI, right? So these are two things that are key, and these are very fundamental to the topic of technology and how it intersects with the green economy.
Well, that's a very interesting point that you brought up, especially when we're talking about, emails. We're thinking about we're not using paper, we're actually helping with the environment. but it still, generates some sort of carbon dioxide along the way. How do you think can tech companies reduce their carbon emissions? How to build a greener app or how to make the websites more sustainable?
I think it really boils down to three things. Number one would be education. Number two would be non-coding digital practices. And I'll elaborate a bit more on that later. And number three, it would be the computer code itself. So going on to the first thing, the most basic thing would be education. And if you look at the textbooks that computer science students are using in universities nowadays, they are the 15th, 16th, 18th edition of a textbook written more than 20, 30 years ago. In other words, the fundamental aspects of how we interact with technology, of computer code itself, hasn't really changed in the last 20, 30, 40 years. It has remained fundamentally the same. And the only changes might be examples used in the textbooks or how the textbooks have changed from non-color to colored versions. And this is very concerning to us because as we go into the future, as technology takes up a bigger portion of our lives, we need to ensure that sustainability as a principle is embedded into computer science, into computer engineering education in our tertiary institutions. And that's something that is sort of starting to happen, but it needs to happen at a far quicker pace, right? And that's really how, when we educate the future workforce, and when these students eventually go into tech companies in the future, they will naturally code greener. So that's the first point. The second point is on non-coding digital practices. What do I mean? We're talking about things that relate to technology that do not involve computer coding. An example would be sustainable UI UX. So when you design a website, right, you use UI UX, user interface, user experience. That's what UI UX stands for. So when you have sustainable UI UX, what happens is that you are designing your computer interface, you're designing your website, your mobile application in a way that is environmentally friendly. A very simple example would be to use a more minimalistic approach to designing your web page so that users who come to your website or your mobile application can quickly find what they need. Because the longer they take, the more they scroll around aimlessly on your web page, the more excessive data is consumed. The more unnecessary data is consumed means that more unnecessary energy is consumed by your device to power the search, right? So this is the second example. And the last point would be computer code itself. And what we see is a lot of times computer code nowadays is unnecessarily bloated. There is a lot of inbuilt redundancy to ensure that, well, the whole system doesn't fail. And while that's good in moderation, we sometimes see it being done excessively by third-party players who are building and selling platforms for a vast majority of our organizations today. So these are three fundamental aspects that can and need to be changed.
And first of all, I'm very curious about the coding that you just talked about, because we recently did an episode about data centers. And we also heard when it comes to AI training and the engineers also talking about, sometimes we don't need a AI model of that size, of a very big size. For certain problems, we can just design a smaller version of AI model, which can be more sustainable. And it just has to be more tailor-made to the demands of their clients. Is that something, similar to the coding that you're referring to?
I think in some aspects that is similar. So what you mentioned would be how mini models would be more environmentally friendly and more relevant than large scale all-encompassing models for certain institutions. For example, a bank would do better having a finance tailored mini model compared to using ChatGPT. And that is a great example of how AI could be greener. When we talk about how computer code can be greener, we're thinking of a couple of things. The first thing is how the entire amount of code can be reduced. It can be streamlined. right? So that's one. The second thing that we're thinking about is how the logic of computer code can change. Let me give you an analogy to what I'm talking about. Imagine if we are running through a lake of water, right? A pool of water, a lake. It is very difficult. But if you freeze the lake, if the lake becomes ice in winter, it is very easy to go through the lake. If the lake is the same as data, then what I'm trying to say now is that if you change the form of data from one way to another, you don't necessarily need to reduce the amount of data, but you can make the execution of actions much faster and by extension require less energy. Similar to how the lake, when frozen, is the same amount of water, but you can go so much faster through the ice as compared to the water.
That's very vivid of an example. But is that, when you're talking about the coding and also the non-coding part of unsustainable practices, when you're talking or working with your clients, are things really that bad? Is their coding really that unsustainable?
I think generally speaking, there is a pretty widespread mentality amongst many industries nowadays that we shouldn't fix something that isn't broken, right? So what that means and what that translates into is that there is a practice amongst technologists, coding practitioners to build on top of existing platforms. So if I have something that have existed since 10 years ago, I'll build on top of it, and someone later will build on top of what I've built, right? So what happens is that this creates a lot of unused technology, unused computer code, unused software, because we're just building on top of each other. There is less of an appetite to kind of like remove what was in the past and completely replace it, simply because it is costly and there is a greater amount of risk to that, which may not be in the interest of the personnel. So what that means is that you've got an increasingly larger, well, data set and increasingly larger system that is very much used only at the tip, right? You can think of it like an iceberg, right? We're just using the tip of the entire system, and we've got all this legacy code and legacy technology that is under the water that no one really sees and no one addresses at all.
It sort of remind me of all the temp files on my computer that they're there and taking up a lot of storage space on my computer. But the question is, I'm not really sure if they're going to come into handy sometime in the future. So I'm sort of restrained from deleting them altogether. Would that same of mindset also occurring to these tech companies when you are trying to talking to them about minimalizing their coding and technology?
Most certainly. And I think that this isn't just a problem in tech companies, but in any company with a large enough technological base. What do I mean? It could be an engineering company, an education company that has a lot of files, right? An education company that has lots of educational content, videos, a maritime company which has a lot of files of the blueprints of ships, right? Stored electronically. All of these companies are also equally guilty as tech companies in this sense. Because when we talk to large companies, we're talking about matrix organizations, right? Large multinational corporates. What happens is that on any given year, if they start about 100 projects, the vast majority of projects actually do not go past that year, which means that they may start 100 projects hypothetically and only go through with 10 projects in the second year. What happens to these 90 projects is a lot of times the vast majority of them are put on hold. So they aren't fully cancelled, so they aren't cancelled and deleted, but they are also not going to proceed to the second year. They're just kept there as a backup, or in case someone thinks of a greater way of conducting that particular project in 5 or 10 years' time, right? So what happens is that you've got this mountain load of half-finished projects that are kept in your computer system, And when that happens at scale in a large corporate, you've got a ton of what we call as zombie data or zombie projects, right? Things that are not quite alive, but not quite dead. And this is a huge problem because this leads to what we call the graveyard, right, of technological code. Because all of them are there, they're consuming space, taking up electricity, but not very useful whatsoever. It is a concern, and we see that some companies are beginning to address it, but more has to be done to ensure that this doesn't become an overwhelming problem. To give you some statistics, the Deloitte University Press actually produced a piece of research in the past that showed up to 90% of data is unstructured. So, what is unstructured data? Structured data is the type of data that AI can use, that ChatGPT and the LLM, large language model behind it, can use. Unstructured data, on the other hand, is data that is literally useless, right? It's data that cannot be used for any purpose whatsoever, but it's kept there. And 90% of the entire digital world we have right now was estimated in that research paper to be unstructured data. Essentially, it's useless data, data that can be of no value whatsoever. And it's very interesting because 90% of data at that point of research was about, if I'm not wrong, 40 zettabytes worth of data. A one zettabyte has 21 zeros in it. So 40 zettabytes of unstructured, useless data, that's a lot of bytes of information that is just there as a zombie.
But are they easy to spot when you're working with this data to spot the good data and the bad data?
I think they are relatively easy to spot. The difficulty comes not in spotting them, but in deciding to do something with them. Because a lot of the inertia comes with unrealized potential in this data. So the what ifs, what if I can use them later? What if they become a gold mine later? So that is the main hurdle for companies when deciding what to do with the data. Because if it's a clear cut, this piece of data is not useful, we're going to delete it, then it becomes very straightforward. But if it's a case of this data isn't useful now, but could be later, then that piece of data becomes one that is stuck in limbo.
Then what would you do about those what if data?
So one of the things that we suggest as a first step would be to put that data into virtual cold storage. What do I mean? So a lot of times this data is kept in a live system in a company, meaning that if you search up your company's intranet, you could still potentially dig up a file or two which is related to that, which means that each time you put in a query, your system will search through every single thing, including those zombified data, before pulling up a piece of information that is relevant to you, right? When we put zombified data into cold storage, what we do is that we literally take them out of the live system. We put them in a separate storage that isn't queried each time we make a search on our system. So each time we search our system, it will no longer go through that pile of zombified data. It will just go through data that is recent, that is more relevant to our searches. It reduces the amount of energy consumed by our system and by extension, the carbon footprint.
It's just when we are trying to pulling up these files, it may take a bit longer, which is some sort of easier compromises on our end.
Yes, yes.
Another question that I have is about your clients. Are they very easy to convince to purchase your services, or you need to do some of communication so that they are convinced and embrace your idea?
Yes, I believe that communication is definitely key because different companies have different priorities. And so when we talk to a company that prioritizes monetary savings, we pitch to them very differently as compared to a company that prioritizes, for example, digital or carbon emission reduction. So what we do is we have a four-pronged approach. And the first prong is to pitch to a company in terms of carbon savings, right? How can you save the amount of carbon, or rather reduce the amount of carbon you're producing? The second prong is to talk about energy savings. The third prong is to talk about data savings. So how much data can you save on the cloud, right? How much cloud processing fees, cloud storage fees can you save? And the last thing would be reputational, where we touch on things that are intangible. How can your company be seen as a pioneer in your particular niche or your particular industry? So different companies, different priorities, definitely different pitches.
And you need to talk to them quite strategically, it seems like. And who would you approach them? For example, who would be more easily to be convinced if you're talking about saving costs? And who would put ESG and also sustainability, cutting carbon emissions, more of a priority?
That's a very interesting question as well, because it is very contextual, meaning that different companies within the same industry behave incredibly differently. What we do is whenever we approach a client, a potential client, we always try to figure out which department has the most leverage. In other words, which department is more key to that company's operations, and by virtue of that, has more budget and more authority to make a decision. So in some companies, especially those who are very much mavericks in the environmental space, we can talk very easily to the ESG team and push things forward. If it's a company that is undergoing, a slightly more difficult financial situation right now, the CFOs, the finance department, might be the place we start our conversation.
And then you are also working with, clients all over the world. Do regions also matter? Like, for example, do European companies or Southeast Asian companies or American companies have this kind of differences?
Yes, very, very much. So in terms of, say, companies in Europe, right, there is actually I would say, slightly more understanding of digital carbon emissions in Europe, in some countries in Europe, potentially, for example, in France, or when we talk to some of our potential clients in the Nordics, there is a slightly larger recognition that digital carbon emissions is a problem, and by extension, it is easier to get them on board to understand that we need a solution for this problem. In Asia Pacific, especially in ASEAN, where I'm in, a lot of times people view digital carbon emissions as something that is very interesting, something that's very fresh, very new, but potentially not top priority yet, because a lot of industries we have in Asia Pacific are still very traditional industries, which means that they might be looking at manufacturing, at automotives, at construction. And for them, even when we talk about decarbonization, the priority might be decarbonization of the physical world first. But where we slot ourselves in is as an interim measure. So if I'm a maritime company and decarbonizing ships is going to cost me a lot of money and a long time, then I might choose to decarbonize the software that powers the ship as an interim measure to show how I'm making progress while I'm waiting for technological breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs on how to decarbonize ships.
That makes sense, though.
Yeah, so it's very, very interesting in terms of how different regions and different companies in the same industry or even within the same country can react when we pitch to them.
Yeah. And now, currently, we're also seeing this sort of debate going on, especially when we're seeing the rise of artificial intelligence technologies and also the data centers going along with it. They're growing very rapidly. And within the climate circles, people are very hesitant when it comes to this type of new high-tech digital technologies because of the sustainability costs that they bring. And so we are seeing this tension between this digital growth that I think we definitely need in our future, and also sustainability goals that's pretty much equally important. How do you see this balancing act between digital growth and the sustainability future?
I think it is a balance that is quintessential for progress for society. There's no question about this. I do understand, and being at the forefront, I would say, of digital sustainability, I do empathize deeply with my fellow environmentalists who are immensely concerned about the impacts of tech on the environment. But on the other hand, I do also see the good that is involved. How technology, for example, can help turn off the lights of rooms that are not in use, right? So at the end of the day, we need to focus on one word, and the word is net, N-E-T, net. So is there a net negative impact or is there a net positive impact? Because at the end of the day, uh, if using technology brings about a net negative impact, then we need to reduce those instances. But where technology produces digital carbon emissions, but has an overwhelmingly positive impact, so it becomes a net positive impact, then we then need to embrace technology. So whenever I talk about the environment and technology, I don't demonize technology. It is inherently a neutral tool. But what I talk about is how we use it and how we maximize the net benefit of it.
I completely agree with you that any form of technology is fundamentally a tool. And then looking into the future in your industry, which is, I believe, a very niche industry at the moment, do you see this industry further expand? And which direction do you believe will digital decarbonization be heading to?
Most certainly, I think that digital sustainability will become mainstream in the next 10 years. And there are many forces that are pushing for that to happen. Some would be out of necessity, some would be out of passion, right? On one hand, we see how energy, data, and of course, sustainability have become major choke points globally. Energy has become a major choke point because energy, for the first time in a long time, can be weaponized to stop entire cities and entire countries. We've seen how power blackouts in certain parts of Europe have paralyzed local economies because energy is used to power every digital device. And if we don't have that amount of energy, we just cannot function as a society as well. We see how data, being intricately linked to energy, has become a major choke point as well. And so all of this bodes well for digital sustainability because green computer coding, low carbon computer coding, as I call it, minimizes the use of data, energy, and minimizes the production of CO2. And what that means is that it is inherently at the middle of the transition. It's in the middle of the energy transition. It's in the middle of digital transition. It's in the middle of the green transition. So being in the middle of all three transitions, if we can get digital sustainability right, we can effectively move to a low data society that consumes less energy and produces less digital carbon emission. So at the end of the day, I believe that in 10 years' time, this will become the main aspect and it will proliferate from a niche subset of technology and a niche subset of the environmental green economy to the mainstream.
Before we go, I do have this last one is about, regulations. Because you mentioned that when it comes to European countries, they are more likely to embrace the idea and more aware of the idea of, low carbon coding or decarbonizing the digital world. I'm sensing that it is because that European do have one of the strictest regulation system in the world when it comes to decarbonization and green development and sustainability. What kind of role do regulations and even the governments play in the future development of the greener version and low carbon version of coding?
I think that governments play an essential role. For example, in China, the government's double carbon peak, right? The 2030, 2060 aim of carbon neutrality and, of course, peak carbon has spurred organizations, companies, institutions to take action. This is also similar in Europe, whereby the Green Deal, as they call it, and of course, the digital transformation roadmap has played a role in ensuring that digital transformation is done in hopefully a sustainable manner. So we see that companies are greatly influenced by governments. And so where there is regulatory pressure, we see that companies tend to allocate more budget and move faster in that direction. So one of the things that we do at Greenie Web as well is that we try to start this conversation with local government, with national government, not just to talk about what we do as a company, but also to share with them how this is the future and how if they begin now, they would be ahead of the curve.
That's very clever of you. And I do hope in 5 to 10 years' time, when digital decarbonization do get mainstreamed in the business world, you can come up to the podcast again to talk with us.
Most certainly. I hope you do remember me, Fei Fei.
I certainly will. Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much for a lot of very interesting insights and open up the world to us.
The pleasure is mine. And thank you so much for having me on the Climate Watch podcast.
A huge thank you to Ian Chu of Greenie Web for joining me on the podcast. And thank you for listening to this episode of Climate Watch. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe, leave a quick review, or share it with a friend. If you have any questions about our planet or suggestions for future episodes, you can always reach me at fei.fei@cgtn.com or find me on my Substack newsletter, Rivers and Mountains. Until next time.